We looked at all of the literature, all of the data that's out there relative to the impact of carbohydrates on cats. And what we found in that very extensive review is that there is no evidence of adverse effects from carbohydrates in the diet so long as the diet provides all of the essential nutrients that cats have. And I qualify it in that way because if you fed a really, really high carbohydrate diet, then you're probably not going to be providing enough protein, enough fat, and enough other nutrients. And that can contribute to an issue.
Welcome to the Call the Vet Show, the podcast that helps pet parents understand and optimize the health of their furry family so they can live the full and happy life you want for them. And here's your host, veterinarian Dr. Alex Avery.
Hello, kia ora. Welcome to another episode of the Call the Vet Show. I've got a fantastic episode for you today. Another brilliant conversation with a dedicated expert, and I'm diving deep into the world of cat nutrition with Dr. Dottie LaFlamme. There's a whole load of myths out there. There's a lot of statements that are made as facts and maybe aren't as accurate or should be made as confidently as they are. And we're going to dive into all of those and a whole lot more, giving you some really practical tips about not just the best thing to feed your cat, but also the best way to feed your cat. But before we get into that, welcome along to another episode. It's great to have you join me today. And if this is the first time you're listening to the show, then hello, welcome. You're in the right place if you believe that your pet is a part of your family and you want to know the best way to care for them, both to keep them as healthy as possible, but also if something comes their way, how to make sure that they are living their best life. And with that in mind, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button on whatever app you're listening to this on. And then lastly, just before we jump into my wonderful conversation with Dr. Dottie LaFlamme, I just wanted to read out this lovely review I've had over on Apple Podcasts from Only Boring People Aboard, which is a wonderful sentiment and a wonderful name. And they wrote, "You will appreciate Dr. Alex Avery's generosity. I recently discovered this podcast and have been listening while tidying up, driving places and doing outdoor chores. It's very generous of Dr. Avery to take the time to share his immense knowledge with us. His guests are also well chosen and impart valuable information. I like how Dr. Avery doesn't sugarcoat some subjects such as obesity and climate change. He tells it like it is." So thank you very much for those wonderful words. And yeah, it really means an awful lot that you took the time to leave that review. If you also enjoy this show and you would like to leave a review or testimonial, you can do that over on whatever podcasting app you're listening to this on, or you can go to ourpetshealth.com/review just to help other people know that this is a show that's worth your time listening to while you're driving into work, which is where I listen to my podcast, or doing chores around the house or in the garden, whatever it is. I'm delighted that you're joining me on this kind of pet health journey that we're on together. And so with that journey in mind and keeping up with the theme of valuable guests that impart incredibly valuable information, I'd love to introduce you to the wonderful Dr. Dottie LaFlamme.
Here's this episode's expert interview.
Dr. LaFlamme, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to this episode and this conversation for kind of a few weeks now since we had it organised, and we're really going to hopefully dive into the world of cat nutrition and some of the myths or the many myths that are out there. And I guess with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I'd love to start with the myth that vets don't learn about nutrition. So how on earth can we know that you know what you're talking about, which is my very impolite way of saying, what's your background and what brought you into the world of nutrition?
Yeah. Well, you raise a good point because some veterinarians don't get trained in nutrition. Others get great coverage in their veterinary curriculum. Personally, I not only have my veterinary degree, but I also have a master's degree in ruminant nutrition and a PhD in clinical nutrition where I focused on dogs. And then I did a postdoctoral residency in clinical nutrition. And then I went to work in research and development, where I focused on canine and feline nutrition for over 25 years. So somewhere along the line, I think I picked up a little bit.
I think that's very modest, more than a little bit, and more than most. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, that education is very varied depending on where you study and where you go. But vets, just like everybody else, can learn as they go along. And certainly I've been doing this job for 16 odd years now, and I certainly know I know a lot more now than I did, on that first day out of vet school and my first day in the job.
Absolutely.
So I guess the first statement that I'd love to explore with you is the fact that cats aren't able to utilize carbohydrates in their diet. And even worse, actually, carbs are harmful to the health of their cat. It's something that I commonly kind of hear pet parents talk about or read comments about. So I'd love your input on those two statements and dive deeper into that. And I guess where that comes from a lot of the time is the knowledge or the statement that cats are obligate carnivores. So, what does that mean, and what is the role of carbs, and can cats actually utilize them?
Well, I hope we have several hours, because it'll probably take that to really dig into each of those.
Sure.
You're right. I mean, those are probably amongst the biggest misperceptions about feline nutrition. Why don't we take it from the top and talk about what it means to be a carnivore and what it means to be an obligate carnivore,
Absolutely.
just
Great
as a
start,
starting point. So carnivores is a taxonomic categorization. Dogs are carnivores, cats are carnivores, bears are carnivores, so forth. And yet there's vegetarian bears. So let's just recognize that the fact that something's called a carnivore in itself doesn't mean anything. The perception that cats are obligate carnivores, what that really means is that cats require certain nutrients that are found in nature only in animal products. A carnivore, basically what that means is that animal naturally will be a prey eater. So let me elaborate a little bit even more on that. When we talk about a dog or a cat or any other carnivore that's eating in the wild, they're eating prey, that means that they're an animal eater, which is different than a meat eater. Some people think, I want to feed my animal like a carnivore, so I'm going to give it steak, I'm going to give it chicken breast, whatnot. Sure, that's wonderful protein, but it's not complete nutrition. When a cat eats a whole animal, when a dog eats a whole animal, they're eating the muscle, but they're also eating the organs. They're also eating the contents of the intestines. So they're getting a much broader collection of nutrients than just eating meat. So carnivore means animal eater, and cats are called obligate carnivores because they naturally require certain nutrients that are naturally found only in animal products. Okay. What it does not mean, it does not mean that carnivores or cats cannot utilize other nutrients. What it means is there's a handful of nutrients that they have to have either naturally from animal product or synthetic. For example, some vitamins, minerals can be provided synthetically.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's a really important definition, because you're right that phrase obligate carnivore, I think, is the logical jump is to say they need to eat meat and only meat, but that's not what it means. They need to have a proportion of the proteins that are naturally present in meat. They need to have that proportion in their diet, but they can absolutely then, the jump goes, not utilize, or it's not harmful, but they can actually utilize all of these other things that they're eating.
Absolutely. And it's certainly not just the proteins from animal sources. It's vitamins and minerals as well. So yeah, lots of different nutrients to consider. Most of the time, the easy thing, of course, is to just think about what nutritionists call macronutrients: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, because they're called macro because that makes up the biggest part of the diet. and it makes up 100% of the calories that the animals consume. But of course, a complete diet, a balanced diet, has those plus vitamins and minerals as needed by the animal. Today, I don't think we're going to be talking about those other nutrients. So we're going to just assume that we're talking about a balanced diet and then focus on the macronutrients, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem with the topic of nutrition is that we could probably talk for a week, Dr. LaFlamme, and still only scratch the surface. So with that in mind, so we've got our cats. They're there. They're hunting their prey. They're small rodents, whatever it is. What kind of profile do they provide the cat? So we've spoken there about the organs, but their stomach contents as well. So they're going to be eating a certain percentage of carbohydrate in their natural diet as well.
Sure. And there's been a couple of studies with feral cats looking at typical diets of feral cats and what that translates to in terms of those macronutrients. And protein is the biggest component. Fat is the next, and carbohydrates is the smallest amount. Somewhere between 2 and 6% of the calories coming from carbohydrates. The biggest chunk of it coming from protein, and fat also making up a big component. This difference between that particular breakdown with, let's call it 5% carbohydrate compared to commercial dry diets that might have 30 to 45% carbohydrates. That difference in carbohydrate content is perhaps part of the misperception or the concern about foods and why are cats getting so much carbohydrate. So we're going to be talking about that, but I want to bring up another point. We've talked about the term of obligate carnivores. We also need to bring up another term, and that's called opportunistic diet. Some people think about this evolutionary diet, whether they're talking humans or they're talking wild dogs and wild cats, based on what those cats in the wild could eat. I want to bring up the term opportunistic diet because that indeed is what wild animals eat. They eat what they're able to hunt, what they're able to catch. And if they are successful in harvesting enough prey, or if they don't have prey, enough roots and leaves and plants and whatever they might eat to fill their bellies, if what they're able to consume has enough nutrients that they survive, then that species, that individual in that species will survive. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a perfect diet. It doesn't mean it's the best diet. It's what the opportunity provides. Yeah. So if we think about feral cats today, yes, they live on a diet that's low in carbohydrate, high in protein, but they also don't live very long. The average lifespan of a feral cat is somewhere in the 3 to 5 year range. Not that they die from malnutrition necessarily. Mostly they die from traumatic issues. They're killed by other animals. They become prey themselves or killed by cars. But the point is that they don't live 15, 20 years like we want our pet cats to do.
Yeah, and that's a hugely important statement to make. And because they are living long enough to breed, and cats breed very successfully and very quickly and at a young age, any nutritional problems that may manifest later on don't make a difference to that overall cat population. That's what I'm hearing you say. That's
exactly what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So with that in mind, and I guess that leads us on nicely to the statement that actually carbohydrates aren't just not able to be utilized by cats, but that they're actually harmful and are responsible for a lot of the chronic diseases that we're seeing, the cancers, the endocrine problems. And because of that, we shouldn't be feeding cats that are otherwise healthy these carbohydrates so that they don't get these problems later on in life. Is there any truth in any of that at all?
Well, let's start with the short answer. No. But then let's go to better context. And let's start by talking about what exactly are carbohydrates and why are they in foods? So carbohydrates it's a broad category that includes sugars. From a biochemical point of view, it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen put together at a particular ratio, and it forms simple sugars like we know of, like table salt. Blood glucose is a sugar. It is a carbohydrate, or they can be much more complex sugars, larger molecules, and we think about starches and we think about complex carbohydrates versus which are found like in grains and whole grains and so forth, which we know from the human perspective is very important and very healthy. So when we think about carbohydrates, first we have to think about, well, actually, there's another whole another category, and that's the indigestible ones, which is fiber. And by definition, they're not digestible. We're not going to talk about those today, but they're also important because they do provide for GI health. They provide foodstuffs for the microflora that live in the gut, which is an important component, whether you're a cat or a person or a dog. That GI microflora is important to our health. And so some amount of the dietary fiber is important to keep them healthy. That said, I think we're going to focus just on the digestible carbohydrates, but still we're talking a big difference between complex carbohydrates, such as found in grains, and simple sugars, which might be found in, table sugar, or in our case, sodas and things like that.
Yeah.
So, and there's a difference in how those are processed and metabolized in the body. So one of the things I want to point out is that if you look at the literature, there are lots of articles that talk about how carbohydrates are bad. And most of that work is coming from the human side, whether it's actually people in the study or mouse models or rat models. They're talking about high carbohydrates bad. But if you look at them, what you find is that those studies were looking at high sugar diets. And if you look a little deeper, what you find is that high carbohydrates, when it's complex carbohydrates, such as whole grains, instead of an adverse effect, you find beneficial health effects. So on the human side, it depends on what kind of carbohydrates we're talking about.
Sure. But we're not tending to give our cats carbonated beverages or candy and things like that. So generally, I guess we're talking about complex carbohydrates. Would that be fair?
Well, I think if we're talking about what's present in diets, it's predominantly complex carbohydrates. But a lot of that, the misperception that carbohydrates are bad is an extrapolation of the sugar. And there have been studies done with cats over several decades, I guess, a few studies here and there. And one of those studies used sugars, high levels of sugar in the diet, and did indeed find some adverse effects when very high levels of sugar was found. That caused some damage to the kidney, and it caused some damage to the GI tract. But when the same amount of carbohydrate in the form of complex carbohydrates was provided, there were no adverse effects. None of those same things were seen. So as a background, we have to take into consideration the effect on the cat may very well depend on what source of carbohydrate is it. Okay. Nevertheless, let's come down to, where should we start? How much carbohydrates do cats need? Okay. Yep. Here we have to differentiate between what we call a dietary requirement and a physiologic requirement. And what I mean by that is dietary requirement means that the animal or the person has to have that nutrient as a component of the diet, or they're not going to survive.
Sure.
That's a dietary essential nutrient. For cats, for dogs, for people, there is no requirement for the carbohydrate to be a part of the diet. That said, there is a physiologic requirement, which means that the cat's body, the human body, has to have carbohydrate in the form of glucose in the bloodstream. Blood glucose is the primary energy source for almost every cell in the body. And if we don't have enough glucose in the bloodstream, basically we're going to die.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we don't want too much, of course, that's associated with diabetes. We don't want too little because then you have hypoglycemia, you have comas, you die. We don't want either of those. We want the right amount in the bloodstream. And because of that, our cat's body, our own body, has all kinds of homeostatic mechanisms. In other words, ways that the body maintains blood glucose at the right level for normal health. Now, getting that back to the diet, okay, I said we don't have to have it in the diet, but we have to have it in the blood. So how does it get into the blood? Well, there's two options. One is it can come from the diet. So carbohydrates in the diet can be digested and metabolized to provide that glucose that's needed by cats, or they can take dietary protein and broke it down. There's a process called gluconeogenesis, which just means glucose, neo meaning new, genesis being made. So the body can make new glucose from protein, or it can have it from carbohydrate in the diet. Because there's that backup capacity to convert protein into glucose, it doesn't have to have it from the diet. And so it's not an essential nutrient, but it's still a wonderful source to provide the glucose that the cats actually do need. And yes, cats are able to digest carbohydrates, process carbohydrates, and use carbohydrates from the diet in a manner similar to other species.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess not something that I want to dive into now, but people who have listened to the show before will know that I've spoken kind of several times about the environmental cost of our pet food and things like that. And if we're, relying on the protein component, we know that, well, it's more expensive to produce that. It has a higher environmental cost. And so,
Sure.
Relying on proteins has that impact as well. So I guess that's that's kind of that part of things. When it comes to then you mentioned diabetes there. It's a good point to maybe say, are there any health conditions where actually it's better not to feed a lot of carbohydrates?
Okay, so you are aware of a review article that some of us did, where we looked at all of the literature, all of the data that's out there relative to the impact of carbohydrates on cats. And what we found in that very extensive review is that there is no evidence of adverse effects from carbohydrates in the diet so long as the diet provides all of the essential nutrients that cats have. And I qualify it in that way because if you fed a really, really high carbohydrate diet, then you're probably not going to be providing enough protein, enough fat, and enough other nutrients. And that can contribute to an issue. So our group that did that review basically found that of the data available, carbohydrate can provide up to as much as 50% of the calories in the diet without causing any adverse effects. Again, so long as there's enough protein in the diet and fat doesn't have to be particularly high, but the lower the carbohydrate, the higher the fat will be, because a diet you got 100%. And if you take one piece of it away, the other two pieces have to make up the difference. And so usually a low carbohydrate diet is higher in fat as well as higher in protein. So in terms of adverse effects from high carbohydrate, really in a healthy cat, it's only if it's so high that it contributes to loss of the other essential nutrients. Again, with the healthy cats, the opposite can have to be considered. What about low carbohydrate diets are their adverse effects. And as I was just mentioning, when you take away one nutrient, the other macronutrients make up the difference. So most low carbohydrate diets are actually high in fat. Fat is much higher in calories than carbohydrate. And so high fat diets actually are a risk factor for obesity. And obesity is a risk factor for a number of health problems in cats as well as other species.
Yeah, it's a huge issue that is increasing in prevalence across the cat, the dog, and the human populations as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But are there any, so we've got some cats, and I guess I'm thinking here the diabetic cats and the high protein, low carb diets kind of being the thought of as the best option, or as far as I'm aware. Is that the truth? And are there any other conditions which cats already may have where we need to be maybe a little bit more cautious?
Sure. The perception that low carbohydrate, high protein diets is beneficial in cats with diabetes. The scientific evidence to support that is not as strong as we'd like it to be, but there is some evidence that that's beneficial, and clinical experience amongst a large number of experts in the field support that there is a benefit in cats that are already diabetic, because these cats they've lost their natural ability to regulate blood glucose. So one of the challenges with diabetes, of course, is the blood glucose gets too high because it's not being taken up into the bloodstream fast enough. It's not being metabolized fast enough. So there's two ways we can try to prevent that excess carbohydrate in the bloodstream. One is put less carbohydrate in the diet, and the other is to feed small amounts of food over an extended period of time, which is the way that cats would naturally eat in the wild, small meals, multiple meals a day. And so that prevents a massive influx of blood glucose all at one time. So those are two things that we can do, in addition, of course, to providing insulin or other medication as needed.
Yeah, sure. And they can be quite challenging, some of these individuals to stabilize. Equally, I have a patient at the moment who is, I believe, 21 or 22 and has been diabetic for 5 years and is going strong.
Nice.
So, defying all expectations. So,
yeah.
But yeah, with good management, that's certainly possible. So Dr. LaFlamme, that's a fantastic, I guess, run through and a brief run through of carbohydrates. And I'll leave links in the show notes to that paper and some of the other resources that we'll talk about. I'd love to switch maybe to our next statement, which is that dry diets are unhealthy because cats have a low drive to drink. They don't drink a lot naturally. They get kidney failure. Therefore, actually, dry diets are causing kidney failure and a host of other problems. Is that the case? Is there any evidence behind that?
Actually, that does not seem to be true. As a matter of fact, there's evidence to the opposite. I think part of the perception that dry foods were going to be causing problems, yes, water is a piece of it, but the high carbohydrate content was also a piece of it. Now, we've talked about carbohydrate, I think, in sufficient detail, but that combination has led to the perception that dry foods are in some way damaging for cats. The reality is the vast majority of cats have no problem maintaining hydration. There are exceptions, and those cats that have exceptions, it may be a cat that's very senior. It may be a cat that already has kidney disease. It may be a cat that has urinary stone disease. There are certain cats that really will benefit from having extra water to their diet. And those cats might do better on a high moisture diet rather than a dry diet. But the vast majority of cats should do just fine on dry food. The evidence, I was actually looking for any scientific evidence that would support the perception that dry foods contribute to kidney disease. And actually what I found was a fairly recent study It said just the opposite, that cats on dry food are less likely to develop kidney disease than those fed wet foods. But if you look at the literature in its entirety, you will find some studies that suggest that dry foods are associated with certain conditions. You might find an association with urethral obstruction, urinary tract obstruction, or urinary tract disease. You might find evidence that dry foods are linked with diabetes. You might find them linked with other conditions. But then there's other studies that show just the opposite, that show, again, there's a protective effect of dry food against kidney disease. There's a protective effect of dry food against thyroid disease. Certainly, dry foods seem to be better in terms of dental condition. So I don't think that we can draw a line and say dry food is bad because really of anything for the vast majority of cats. But there are individual cats. And so, you as a veterinarian would be able to diagnose a cat that might need more water. But for our cat owners out there, I think if you like feeding dry food and your cat enjoys eating dry food, there's really no reason to switch in a healthy cat unless a veterinarian diagnoses another problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So just because cats who have existing problems benefit from or may benefit from a higher water content diet doesn't mean that all cats need that diet. I guess from the point of view of feeding, I mean, that's an interesting one. So I feed my cats a dry kibble the majority of the time, but I do also feed them different types of wet food, because one thing I worry about is cats becoming fixated on a particular diet, kind of at the kibble junkie, and then we want to switch them to this higher moisture content food should anything happen, and we really struggle to get them to eat it. So that's kind of my view on kind of feeding cats. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And as from what we know about cats, it really is a good strategy, even if it's just as an occasional treat. It doesn't necessarily have to be every day, but it's also a good way to, if you want to provide a flavor variety for your cat, instead of constantly changing the primary diet, you can be feeding a nutritionally balanced dry food, for example, and then the canned food that you put on top of that or beside that, or whatever, could be different flavors across different days. But you're right. You don't want cats to become fixated on a particular food. And while we're probably not really talking about kittens here, but that seems to be a key time for introducing cats to different foodstuffs is when they're young. So if you do have a kitten, feeding a variety of different foods while they're young is a great idea for exactly that purpose. They learn that, this is food too.
Yeah. And it's something that people really struggle with. My cat's fussy and won't eat that diet is something that I hear all the time. But yes, we train them, if you like, we socialize them to their food. My cats know that what goes in their bowl they need to eat, or else they're going to go hungry, and they quite happily accept new diets straight away the first time I feed them. So they've not trained me, if you like, just to feed them one particular thing, because they're very smart, our cats.
Thank you for putting it that way, because our cats are quite good at teaching us how to care for them.
Yeah,
how to spoil them.
And we're suckers for it. So yeah, they're part of the family. We want them to be as happy as they can be. And that's a great way to switch, I guess, to the last thing I want to talk about today, Dr. LaFlamme, which is about how cats kind of like to eat, because you mentioned earlier that they naturally eat that smaller, more frequent meal. And I guess they're hunting for that. There's that act of searching for their food and hunting and killing. I've also heard that from a feeling full point of view, and we spoke about obesity as well, that actually maybe feeding one big meal is the best thing that we can do to help them stop feeling hungry. How do you recommend people go about feeding their cat? Is it, that ad lib feeding? Probably not. With having food down all the time so that they can choose to have these small meals. Do we how can we feed our cats to best optimize their health, physical and mental, maybe?
Okay. Well, it's a great question, and unfortunately, the simple answer doesn't exist, because every cat is an individual, every home environment is unique, and so what works in one household may not work in another household. So despite that, let's kind of talk about some pros and cons of different approaches. One thing that we both know is that very few cats are in a single cat household. I mean, there are some, of course, but most of the cats have at least one or two feline siblings. And so we have to think about, how are we going to feed all of the cats? If you're meal feeding, it's not so difficult to set down one bowl per cat, give the cats half an hour, perhaps in different rooms if need be, to prevent stealing, give them time to eat, and then take up whatever's left, if anything. And that's it. And then they're done until the next meal time. And you can feed them at least twice a day. Actually, cats can survive once a day feeding, but most of us would prefer twice a day. Cats might prefer 10 times a day. But you can get by with feeding once or twice a day. But even that separation, I think, doesn't work in many households. What a lot of people tend to do is they'll put dry food down that all the cats can have access to. And then in addition, they will feed wet food. And sometimes the wet food can be separated amongst the different cats. But it's very typical for cats to get a combination of dry food and wet food. Is it necessary? No. But as we were just discussing, there are certain advantages to it. As far as feeding frequency, again, cats in the wild, are whether actually it's not just cats in the wild, but feral cats will tend to eat many different meals a day, and part of that is because they have to hunt for their food. So they'll eat, they'll catch a mouse or a bird or a lizard and they'll eat it, and then they'll catch another and then they'll eat it, and so forth and so on. But even in a research setting, given the opportunity, most cats will generally be nibblers, and they will eat up to 20 times a day if they have the opportunity. But that's usually measured with individual cats who don't have other cats competing for that same food.
Sure.
And so that creates a different scenario, because if cats are going to be eating each other's food, then you have to think about what's the best way to do that. So bottom line, I can't give you what's the perfect way to do it, because every home is a different situation. There are a few tips that I can provide. In households where there are cats of different body condition scores, in other words, you have your lean cats and you have your fat cats, what is perhaps useful is to use a feeding box, a creep feeder, basically a box that has a small hole cut into it that only the skinny cats can get in, and their food is placed in there, and they are allowed to go and come and go as they please, whereas the fat cats can't get into it, but they then have to be fed controlled amounts as many times a day as the owners choose to do so. Another deal with the obese cats is a wise thing to do is measure out their food once a day. Okay. And if you have multiple cats, you measure it out once a day on the kitchen scale, 50 grams for this cat, 70 grams for this cat, whatever, put it in their little baggie, feed it to them as many times a day as you wish. But when the bag's empty, they get nothing more, is another way. Active feeding toys is probably the direction that most nutritionists are encouraging, and I'm with them on that. I think if we can encourage cats to work for their food, it replaces their ability to hunt for food. So toys, whether it's a ball or whether it's one of these various mazes or whatever, putting the food into a feeding toy is a great way to do it because it encourages activity. It's mental stimulation. They burn a few calories. It slows down their eating. There's lots of benefits to it. So that's another thing that I would certainly recommend.
Yeah, fantastic. And those, they don't have to be the expensive ones on Amazon, although Black Friday is coming up, but they can be homemade. And I guess we're talking about, even a kind of a toilet roll in a cardboard tube with a few holes punched in it, and the cat has to bat it around and the kibble falls out. Or
a water bottle with holes punched in it that the kibbles can fall out of it. It can be as simple as that. Sure.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Dr. LaFlamme, I love that practical tips that we can all take, because I think that the fat and the thin cat is a very common reality that people do struggle with, but the fat cat is the first and the quickest to steal the food of the thin cat, who's maybe not quite so food driven as well. So I love that. For people who want to dive more into some of the research or some of the other resources that are out there, where would you recommend they go, or to find out more about you and the work that you've done as well?
Apparently my name's splattered over a lot of places, but I have to include this caveat because we should have done this up front. That all those years of research that I was doing, I was working for a pet food company, but it was in basic research. And so I do feel very, very confident that my research has held up, as you've seen it in peer-reviewed publications. So they're welcome to find that in many places. But some of the best places to find information is I like petdiets.com. It's actually a website by a veterinary nutritionist, and they provide consultation services for a fee, but they also have a lot of free resources on that website where people can go and read questions and answers and good information. Petfoodology.org is another one. It's out of Tufts University, and lots of great resources for cat owners there. So I think those are some good ones. Veterinarians might be interested in additional information out of the World Small Animal Veterinary Association. The nutrition group there has some great resources that's targeted towards veterinarians. Some cat owners may be able to enjoy those as well.
Yeah, they dive deep into things, but the Pet Foodology, the Tufts resource, is certainly one that I'm familiar with, and it's very readable, it's very accessible, and explains things in a very clear way. Well, Dr. LaFlamme, thank you so much for your generously donating your time to talk to us about this really important topic. So I hope we've covered some fantastic ground that people will find interesting, but also actionable, and maybe help calm any anxiety they might have about how they are currently feeding their cat, and give them some tools to make changes should that be required. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Helping your pet live the happy, healthy life they deserve.
I so enjoyed that conversation with Dr. LaFlamme. It was really eye-opening. I mean, from my point of view, it helped reinforce a lot of the information that I've been telling my clients, and I hope for you it really does break down some of those myths and misconceptions and popular statements that you'll hear in various places in the online world, and maybe in person as well. Ultimately, we all want the best for our pets, our dogs and our cats, of course, and feeding them the right way and the right diet is so important for optimizing health. I'll leave all of the links in the show notes to all of the things that Dr. LaFlamme discussed, the places that she recommended you go to dive into more content on this topic, but also talking about other nutritional considerations, including that environmental aspect that I mentioned briefly during that conversation as well. So it's been a pleasure to hang out with you again for another episode of of the Call the Vet podcast, make sure you hit that follow button. And if you did find this interesting, then also sharing it with your friends and family or on social media, just to help get the word out and help educate more pet parents, no matter where they are in the world. And then until the next episode, I'm Dr. Alex. This is the Call the Vet show, because they're family.
That's it for this episode of the Call the Vet show. Be sure to visit callthevet.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our fantastic bonus content. We'll see you next time.